Oh boy. What's up, everybody? This is Ryan, and you are watching episode 54 of my live stream Q&A. So, yeah, let's get started here. As you can see, unfortunately, the lighting isn't the best today because it's actually a pretty overcast day out there for the first time in like 2 months. It's been very, very warm in BC, which is pretty rare. Anyways, so yeah, what do we got here? So we got No Name, who I actually know what his name is. Naline, Mr. Dragonborn, what's up? And we have Bouchan. Welcome. Welcome, mesdames et messieurs. So let's get into it. Yeah, so as usual, we'll start the show off with the my least favorite part of doing this whole live streaming thing, but arguably the most important part, which is if you enjoy the show and you'd like to see me do what I do better, then please do me a favor and consider supporting WiseAss in the following different manners. Please consider following WiseAss on your preferred social media platforms. So we have Google+, if you know, I'm assuming about 10 of you maybe use Google+. We have a Facebook account, we've got a Twitter account, and we have a Slack channel. So the Slack channel is basically like a group chat system. So yeah, consider joining us and supporting us on all those different platforms, and it's also a good way to connect with the WiseAss community. Obviously, you're probably watching this on YouTube, I would assume. So please do consider subscribing if you haven't already, and if you learned something today, do me a favor and hit the like button down below. Now, this channel is partly supported from donations from wonderful people such as yourself. Now, if you can't afford to donate, that's totally fine. I do this stuff for free anyways, but yeah, if you would like to throw me a couple bucks, then please do consider supporting more directly on Patreon or PayPal. Links in the description box below. And that is my commercial for today. All right, so we got a couple things going on. Let me just get into some announcements really quickly. So announcement number one is that I recently completed and uploaded a video where I talk about basically the most important things that a junior or beginner developer needs to know. And basically those three main things were how to learn new things quickly, how to apply those new things in working application code, and how to basically create, basically it was a call to action to create an online portfolio using revision control systems such as GitHub. So if you are curious, if you're a beginner developer watching this, then please do go and check out that video. You're probably going to enjoy it because, like I say, as a self-taught developer, pretty much the most important skill which I had to develop was being able to learn things really quickly. And I knew that since I was teaching myself, I would have more flexibility over what I studied. So being able to study things even quicker was sort of like a double advantage. So anyways, consider checking that video. And yeah, I don't think there's any announcements other than that. Of course, we will do the live stream, live coding tomorrow, and things will pretty much carry on there. But I do apologize if I'm a little tired. I'm super busy. So many different projects going on, it's insane, but I'm really excited because they're all things I want to work on for a change. It's just, it's one of those situations where on an average day, I'm usually putting in 2 hours writing, 2 hours studying, hopefully an hour coding, hopefully an hour doing my, social media stuff. And then the next day, it's usually like an hour of writing and then 4 hours of video making. So life is not boring for me, but unlike before in summertime, I actually am pretty much picking my own schedule right now. So that's been super awesome. Anyways, I do apologize if I look and sound a bit tired. I will heavily indulge in some caffeine here and get started. Hey, what's up, Taha? So Bhushan asks what the topic for today is. So what I was planning, so I did get a question sent in this morning, which I'll answer first. So what I'm going to do is I didn't really have time to prepare a long lesson, but I thought, you know, the past 2 live streams, most of what I talked about was Dagger 2 and dependency injection. And one of the things, when I have a couple episodes where it tends to be like super technical and implementation related, I kind of feel bad for the noobs, the beginners out there, because as much as I try to help people with the more complicated stuff, we can tend to lose sight of the fact that the noobs are kind of the people that need the most help. So my thoughts for this episode is I will answer Smart Pete's question first, but I would like the beginners watching, if there are any, to please consider asking some questions. And like I say, they don't have to be Android-specific questions. They can be to do with programming in general, with software architecture, really anything related. Whatever's on your mind, if there's something you've been wondering about, just ask me a damn question, and I'll try and answer it. So, yeah, that's basically it. Let's jump into question number 1. So this question came from Smart Pete, and Smart Pete asks, hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, so can you describe the difference, I actually paraphrase this a little bit, but can you describe the difference between the various build types, product flavors, and source sets? And Smart Pete mentioned specifically mock and prod. I guess Smart Pete has been looking at a code lab by Google, which employs these various different product flavors, build types, and all of that stuff. So the very first thing I wanted to talk about is kind of an interesting, somewhat of a complaint. So one of the things you run into in the Android documentation, and it's getting way better. Overall, the Android team's documentation and their tutorials, the quality is just skyrocketed from what it was like back in 2014 when I was learning this stuff. But one of the things that is fairly typical, unfortunately, is that you'll have an article like configuring build variants or something like that, and they'll go through and they'll explain to you, this is how you set up build types, this is how you set up product flavors, this is how you set up different source sets, which is all valuable information. The problem with it is that, and I ran into this, and I believe this is what Smart Pete is running into, is that as a beginner, you don't really necessarily know what to use something like that for. And so that was a pretty common issue that I would run into, is I'd find a new article and I'd see something like, say, build types, and the article wouldn't really address the when, where, and why, but it would do a pretty good job with the what. So what I'm going to do is, in order to answer your question, Smart Pete, I'm going to sort of give you first the general idea of all of these things, and then we'll go through a couple specific cases, because the part of the issue with, part of the confusion with build types and product flavors and all these things is that some of them are only useful in specific use cases. And when I say use case, I'm not meaning in terms of architecture. I mean just as a developer, you only need them when you need them, sort of thing. But anyways, let's get started. So let me just find my notes here. So the main thing you want to keep in mind with all of these things is essentially our goal with these tools is to create independently, I'm making this up off the top of my head, so we'll see how we do, but independently deployable slash, let's say compilable slash testable slash deployable versions of an application. So this is the overarching goal of all of these things. We basically want to create a situation where, depending on what we're trying to do, depending on our use case, we want different versions of our application to be anything from, say, testable to actually deployable on a device to really whatever you're trying to achieve here. So that's the general idea, and hopefully that makes sense. Now, you might be wondering, how do we basically have multiple different versions of an application? So this is kind of the next important part. We do this by configuring our project, mainly with Gradle, to allow different source sets to be built at different times slash with different configurations. So I really want to just specify, this is a really important word to understand in case you don't. So source sets, it's basically different independent set, yeah, I could say that. Different independent, how could I phrase that? Different, I should have figured this out ahead of time, but hopefully it makes sense what a source set is. It's a collection of source files, so different collections of source files for different usages. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is I'm just going to go into full screen Camho mode for a moment while I pull up a couple of pictures here, which will kind of help you get a visual understanding of what I'm talking about. Where is it? There. Okay. So, why do we kind of want to be able to build to different source sets? So, just down here I've got like a mini diagram of a typical model view presenter type setup. Now, this isn't especially important outside of the fact that if you're following something like a 3-layer architecture, your architecture will be easier to test, especially MVP. But basically what we want to do is, let's say we want to be able to test our presenter or controller without actually having to talk to a real database. There's a lot of different ways to do that, but one of the most straightforward ways to do that is to have a source set where you have the real view and the real model, and then to have another source set which has fake versions of certain files, usually named the same thing, so you don't end up having to change whatever class is using the fakes. So when I mean fakes, fake view, fake model, the thing about that is that I do need to kind of put this caveat in here. There's just a lot of information to do with testing, but simply put, for example, having a mock source set and product flavor, you can pass in test doubles. So there's a whole bunch of jargon with test doubles. So you'll see the word mock, fake, spy. You'll see all these things. I'm not going to get into the finer details, but in the general sense, what you're doing with, say, the mock source set is you're going to want to have a situation where there's certain things in your app that you're going to want to test, and then you're going to be testing those things against the fake versions, the test doubles. So that is one example of a primary use case where you would want to employ, for example, a mock product flavor and a prod product flavor. So now I'll just kind of go into some more specifics here, and hopefully that'll kind of cement things. So we'll just kind of go piece by piece through a couple examples. So let's start with build types. So generally speaking, you're going to want a debug build type for use by developers testing an application. I should say testing / developing. And then you'll also typically want a release build type for use in product releases. So just an important note, typically in debug, you'll turn off code shrinking / obfuscation. Typically in debug, you'll turn off code obfuscation and shrinking, which is through ProGuard. And essentially what that stuff is so shrinking will shrink your APK and like get rid of unused files, I believe. Obfuscation is more of like a security measure. So it makes it harder to reverse engineer your application code. You typically don't want to use this in, say, your debug types. And the reason why is that you'll actually want to be able to see pretty explicit stack traces in your debug build, I would think. For release, typically you'll turn on ProGuard and apply minify enabled, which is the code shrinking. And so this is just kind of, this is when you'll want to actually use ProGuard, and especially for security. And there was one final point here I was going to make. What was it? I forget, whatever. So that's the basic, these are the most common build types I've seen. Now, the thing about this is Gradle is super customizable, so you can really do whatever you want, but that should cover the basic types. Then we have product flavors, and I'm probably going to stop. I'm going to spell out the Canadian spelling because screw you guys, but product flavors. I should say Canadian / UK spelling. Canadians and people from England almost always put like O and U together, whereas Americans like to just say flavors. More efficient that way, I guess. Anyways, not making fun of Americans, but I guess they're more concise. Anyways, I digress. So for product flavors, this one is really, really up to your use cases. Like I say, if you want, you can. So typically, US specifically mock, and prod. So I'll address these two in particular. So for mock, as I said before, this is where you'll keep test double versions of certain parts of your app. Typically, that would be data IO sources, like so you could do network adapters like retrofit, or local persistence like room. So when we switch to our mock product flavor, we might have like a fake version, a fake room, or just a fake version of the database. If you're using interfaces, one of the key points here is you want to be using interfaces to communicate across the boundaries of your architecture. And the reason why is that when you use interfaces and apply dependency injection, then it's very easy to swap these things out. If you don't use interfaces and you don't have dependency injection applied, then what'll happen is your mock source set and your prod source set will have to necessarily kind of be, even the code that you're testing will have to be different, which is just totally takes the point out of having multiple source sets. So anyways, slight digression there, but I think that's a useful point. Production, of course, stands for production, and this is when you'd use the real network adapters well, I'll just say the real services slash adapters slash data IO type stuff. So that's where you typically put it. I'm going to make another point about this because you don't actually necessarily always need to do this. It depends on how you set things up. But maybe, so there's a couple more examples, like let's say you have a demo, we could have like a free, so for a free version of your app with limited features. And then you could maybe have like a pro version or full version, fully featured, no ads or something like that. So beyond pretty much mock and prod, it's really going to depend on what your use case is. There's other things you can do, like different source sets for different API levels, so like lower Android APIs. I think everyone hopefully gets the basic gist though of what these things are for. Now hopefully I can recall to my brain what the last point I was going to make. Right, so so here's the thing about all of this stuff. You're probably, one of the questions you're thinking is like, do I need to do this? In some sense, sorry, I forgot to talk about the last point. So which actually ties into this. So you might not actually need to have, for example, a mock and a prod source set. It's probably a good idea, especially in a larger application, but to give an example, there's ways you can configure your application to test without having different flavors. So for example, if you look at Kotlin MVP Calculator, link in the description box below, you'll notice that I don't actually have mock and prod build types here, but I'm still able to test my application. So this is the next point, which I almost forgot to talk about. So the last little topic here is source sets. Typically speaking, holy crap, I'm in an apartment and the upstairs neighbors, it sounds like they're tap dancing right now or something. Anyways, so I'm pretty sure they're drug dealers actually, because they've blocked off their, I just want to digress for a moment. So they've blocked off their window, and I'll hear them like just moving around as late as 4 a.m. or 6 in the morning. They'll be up and about. So given the neighborhood that I live in right now, they are probably drug dealers, which is why I haven't phoned in a noise complaint. Anyways, quick digression. Where the hood at? Anyways, sorry. Source sets. So typically speaking, we've got main, we've got test, and Android test, which is super obscure. Anyways, so I'll explain what these mean. Is that actually capitalized? I don't think it is. No. Yes. It is. Okay, so let's talk about what these are. So for main, this is where source, which will be common to all types slash variants slash whatever will go. So this is like, you could call this like common or something. I'm not saying you should, but you know, this is like kind of common source code that is pretty much going to be used everywhere. So that's what main is. So test is used for executing unit tests on the JVM. So when you're unit testing, which is what I tend to prefer to do, then you will put your unit tests in the test source set. And if you look in the test source set in my application, you will see a whole bunch of unit tests, which work with mocks. Cool. Now, as you might notice, I am actually able to use these mocks without actually having to bother with a mock source set. So this is kind of the caveat that I was going to add, and then I forgot about the source set thing. So you don't necessarily need to use fakes or have a mock source set if you don't have anything that goes in it and you're still able to test your application. Don't include it. It's utterly pointless. Only include it if that's kind of how you've decided to set up your things. My vocabulary is pretty limited today, it seems. Anyways, yeah. So that's what test is for. So it's basically for unit testing. Android test, so here you can think Mockito, J, unit, I hate the name of this thing, Hamcrest. Yeah, anyways, I won't go off on a tangent there, but it's just such an ugly name for some reason. Anyways, then we've got Android test. So is used for running, come on, brain, you can do this. User interface tests. What's this called? Yeah, we'll just say running user interface tests. So we're thinking espresso, for example. So testing the user interface, and typically how that will work is you'll use espresso. And to be honest, I don't actually have any experience using espresso because the way I build my applications, I don't typically have to test my views very much. So I'll be honest, I don't actually really do this. I probably should, but that's one of the side effects of the way I build apps. Anyway, so yeah, that's where if you want to run like a user interface testing. So generally what that looks like is you'll like run your app. You'll force it to say, I don't know, textView.setText, and then you'll verify if that text view currently has the characters of whatever you set it to. Depending on how you set things up, you don't necessarily need to spend a lot of time testing your view. Like, you don't actually need to test that set text actually works, because then you're testing the Android framework itself, which you can be pretty reasonably assured that the Android team does that. So anyways, I think I've been talking for quite a while, so let's kind of just wrap that up here. So the general gist of it, test is where you put unit testing stuff. Android test is where you'll put the other stuff. When you add a product flavor, you can also have source sets for mock and prod. The source from main will, like I say, automatically be included when you build to, say, the product or mock build variant. And so, yeah, like I say, this is where you put production source. This is where you put test double source. Generally speaking, I can't really think of a different use for that. And then again, we could have free, pro, and full, and that's all. All of this just comes down to, in some cases, I want to build the app with this code. In some cases, I want to build the app with this code. But what I don't want to do is I don't want to have to keep changing main. I don't want to have to keep altering this in order to test it, which is kind of the main purpose of all these different build variants. It's to make it so that things which don't change, things which do change are easy to swap in and out quickly. So in a nutshell, that is basically the general gist with build types, product flavors, source sets, and hopefully that answers your question. All right. Once again, I thought I was talking for like 10 minutes, but I see I've been talking for like 25, business as usual. Let's run a quick commercial break and we'll get started. I guess I did end up giving a big lesson today, inadvertently. All right. Okay. So what do we got going here? And just a reminder, beginners, if you're watching, ask some damn questions. I don't want to spend all day talking about complicated stuff. That was good though. That was a good general beginner topic. Okay, what do we got? I'm going to be a little picky because I've got a couple questions here. So, what have we here? So, oh wow. Okay, so for starters, all right, so Isaiah asks, could you explain MVP VM? If there is a good open source project, that would be great. So, to be honest, I would actually, for this particular subset of architecture, this is actually basically the way I build my applications. And I would recommend you check out Kotlin MVP Calculator in the description box below. It says MVP, but it does include a ViewModel for front-end persistence. Now, you asked if I could explain it. The thing about that is if I get started explaining Model View Presenter, then it'll be 10 o'clock really quickly and I won't get to any other questions. So what I would suggest to you, to answer part of your question, I think I do this pretty well in a pretty simplified manner if you want to learn the basics. So I would consider checking out my repository, Kotlin MVP Calculator, because I do exactly that. And if I, just to like really simplify how it works, oh yeah, great voice crack. To really simplify how it works, it's just typical model view presenter, except I have a view model object, which basically functions as a front-end data store. So if I were to show you another magical diagram of mine, this is basically how I build applications. So we have the front end, which will have the view, we'll have the presenter, and then I'll have a front-end data store for session and temporary data. In my code, that's typically a view model. In other people's code, they'll have a view model, which is also a front-end decision maker. I don't like to do that, but you know, to each their own. And the backend will be like a backend decision maker, blah, blah, blah. So just in a nutshell, all you really need to do is just build model view presenter and then treat the front end, the view model rather, as just another part of the model. The only difference with it is that it's a part of the model that holds the current data necessary to render the UI. So it's not a decision-making thing, which to me it never should have been. So anyways, obviously my longtime viewers know that I love to rant about the way people use view models. All right. Anyway, so I won't go into more detail into that unless you have a more specific question, because I can't, it would just take really long. But if you have like a specific question about this how the code in there works or anything like that, let me know and I'll try and answer it. And if I get no more good questions, then I might riff on that a little. Okay, so that was that one. What else have we got? Java, Kotlin. Oh geez, couple good questions. So Taha, I do see your question. I'm gonna kind of leave it towards the end, just because. So for two reasons. Number one, I want to try and keep this less technical today, but I might still get to your question. And number two, so I can show you partly how to set it up with coroutines, but I'm actually in the process of setting up Room with coroutines, so I don't really have source code immediately available. But the general setup wouldn't be, much different than how I set it up with in Kotlin MVP Calculator. I'll still have a repository and blah blah blah, but I probably won't get to your question today. That's a really great question, but I'll try and answer that maybe next live stream or something. What else have we got? So here we go. That's a really interesting question. Okay, so this is a neat one. So Naline asks, do you recommend using observers as callbacks, like showing a toast or a communication between two fragments? So I'm going to kind of parcelize this question. So do you recommend using observers as callbacks? Okay. So how can I kind of unpack this one here? So in some sense, the way we typically handle asynchronous communication between different parts of the application. Is that directly related here? Do you recommend using observers? I think that's correct. So in some sense, the way we typically handle asynchronous communication between different parts of the application is with CPS, which stands for Continuation Passing Style, which is a big word for callbacks. That's what this big word means, callbacks. So when you're saying, do you recommend using observers as callbacks? Technically, that's kind of what an observer is by default, what the observer pattern is. I'm just trying to think of how to kind of approach this question. Here's what I would say. I'll kind of type this out. This is an interesting kind of. I think there's a bigger topic than. So Nalina's touched on something which is kind of a big conceptual question, which is which parts of your application should be and coroutines is kind of ruining my explanation here because it's so amazing. Which parts of your application? Just give me a moment here. I gotta think this out. Here's what I would say. If you have a situation where two objects are fine talking to each other directly and in a synchronous manner, then you basically don't need to bother with the observer pattern. So from this little axiom here that I'm saying, you can kind of infer the observer pattern promotes loose coupling. I'll explain that in a moment. Loose coupling and makes asynchronous code easy to deal with. What I would kind of say is, in order to answer your question, do I recommend using observers as callbacks? My brain's not super having a great time parsing this question, but if I would kind of, because technically that's, I believe, what observers are inherently, but you'll want to use something like the observer pattern when you want to promote loose coupling, which is a fancy word for I can easily change. So instead of having object A talk to object B and then hard coding that in, we have observer talking to observable. We've got event. We've got event listener, event producer. So they know less about each other. They just know that this one listens for things, this one produces things. So that's kind of the general usage of the observer pattern. It also makes asynchronous code easier to deal with because you get the callback. You get, depending on what library you're using, your data gets returned at some point in time to be handled in a Lambda typically. So that's my general input. Hopefully that gives you something useful. Now you said specifically, where was it? Did I accidentally delete it? I swear there was something about fragments. I think I accidentally deleted part of your question. Sorry about that. Let's just find it again. Okay, yeah. So the other part is like, so for example, showing a toast or communication between two fragments. So here's what I would basically say. This is really just going to depend on how you structure your application. I can't really easily answer your question here. So for example, the way I build applications, I don't really, generally speaking, mind my presenter and my fragment just directly, not directly, they talk to each other through an interface, but they don't necessarily use observers. They just kind of directly call each other. I should mention direct style is when objects receive direct responses in a, how can I, unfortunately I have to introduce more jargon in order to explain that. The opposite of kind of doing callbacks is just direct style. I'm kind of going all over the place here and I apologize, but basically to kind of answer your question, hopefully, you don't need to use the observer pattern everywhere. It works best between different layers of your application, and it works best for things that you want to be automatically handled. So I'm not saying don't use it, for example, for things like when to show a toast or when to, again, so you don't want fragments I wouldn't want fragments directly talking to each other at all, as far as I'm aware. So yeah, anyways, I can't really answer this further, but hopefully that gave you some useful information. Anyways. Unfortunately, the problem why I was waffling so much on your question is, if you say, do I recommend using blah as blah? And the problem is that it depends on A, B, C, and D. Like, how do you build your application, what library you're using, your architecture style. So I can't really give you a more specific answer. Maybe I can and I just suck. Who knows? Anyways, hopefully that was at least somewhat useful. I can... This is not something I'm super well versed in, so let's see here. Oops, didn't write that properly. Okay, so Bishan asks, can you please explain how Android CI /CD pipeline works in Bitbucket? So for those who are not aware, CI stands for continuous integration. So just big caveat here, this is not something I have a huge amount of experience doing. But I've done a little bit of work with Bitbucket and using Bitbucket plus Circle CI. So insofar as I understand this correctly, the way that pipeline works with Bitbucket and continuous integration is, so basically in your Bitbucket repository, you of course have your source files. So if I'm not mistaken, when you set up continuous integration with, for example, I think Circle CI was the one I used, or maybe it was Pipeline. Again, not super experienced here. But how it basically works is that your continuous integration system will basically grab the latest commit and then build it, and basically be running your application, or it will try to build it. If it fails to build, then it will let you know. It will say, hey, you just committed this stuff and the build is now failing. So in a nutshell, it's like having another copy of your application kind of running all the time. And you can configure it with other stuff. Like I think you can configure it to see if all your tests are passing. But again, we're getting into stuff I don't have a lot of practical experience working with directly. And the main reason for that is recently I've had the opportunity to work with a team of developers where that kind of thing has become more relevant to me. But in my prior experience, I mostly just work on my own small projects. So yeah, that probably doesn't answer your question super well, and I'm just not qualified to talk much more about it, but that's basically how it works, and hopefully that was somewhat useful. Why would you want to do that? Obviously, you're going to want to know if your production code is building and working properly, and using continuous integration and configuring it to work with Bitbucket makes it so that each time you upload a new commit, you push a new commit, then it should try and build that. And if it works, it'll pass. You'll get all your green lights. If it doesn't work, it won't pass, and you'll see some red lights. So that's CI with Bitbucket in a nutshell. I don't have advice for other tools there. That's the only tool I've used for continuous integration. Okay, what else have we got? All right. Oh God, yes. Oh, you asked such a good question. Oh. Molto bene, signore. So, for some reason I'm going to pronounce your name as if it was a French word. Verdant asks, Verdant asks, hey, could you please discuss the migration of an app from Java to Kotlin? What is the strategy you would recommend, and what are the potential pitfalls from your experience? So I have a lot of experience. I have the best experience. I've got lots of experience doing this. Okay, so what is the strategy you would recommend, and what are the potential pitfalls? So migrating an app to Kotlin. So number one, in most cases, Android Studio's code conversion tools will help you out. So a lot of your code, you're going to be able to just copy it from the Java source and then paste it into a Kotlin file, and then it'll do the conversion for you. It does tend to break down with nullables because Java doesn't have the concept of nullables. If you're wondering what those are, nullables are like, if I say in Kotlin, let's hop into the IDE. So if you have a value like this, we're saying this thing may never be equal to null. This should throw an error, I believe. Oh, whatever. Maybe I need to build it or something. So you're never, references are either allowed to be null or not. So if you want it to be allowable to be null, you have to add this question mark. And what that'll do is this. The reason why I'm screwing this up is because I don't have the type listed explicitly. So if I do that, I think it'll say, yeah, that'll throw an error. Okay. So in Kotlin, if you have a type, you can list the type, so we can have string or int or whatever. And if we don't include the nullable modifier, then you're not allowed to set a reference equal to null. Whereas if you do this may be null, it can be an actual value. Now the reason why I bring this up, let me just make sure I properly fix this code here. The reason I brought that up is because that's one case where when you're converting from Java to Kotlin, that's just not a thing in Java, so you could run into some issues there and have to handwrite it. So yeah, so number one is that, do make use of the conversion tools. What I would suggest, try to have, how can I put this? So here's the, let me riff on this for a moment. So the good news is that if you have the Java source right beside you, it's usually easy to kind of rewrite it in Kotlin. The problem is that Kotlin is a different language, and this is something my friend Dorel rightly criticized me when I was writing some Kotlin code, is that what we don't want to do is we don't want to just write Java. We don't want to write Kotlin in a Java way when it's better written in a Kotlin way. So what does that kind of mean? So you mentioned, like, what are kind of the common potential pitfalls? So one of the most common things that I kind of had to deal with is that there are certain cases, I'm not sure, where am I going to be able to demonstrate this? Let's see. Just trying to think of a good example here. I think maybe I can show... Yeah, this is probably going to be the best example I have, and even then I need to clean this up. But one of the most important things, for example, is I could have written this code using Kotlin in a Java way. So I could have like set up a for loop and went blah, 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 and set it up basically how you would do it in Java. Whereas in Kotlin, you're going to want to make use of these extension functions, for example, to write more concise Kotlinized code. So just one of the main pitfalls is that a lot of times when you're converting from Java to Kotlin, you'll still be totally stuck in your Java paradigm. And so you're going to want to, over time, look for places where you can sort of use Kotlin's power for the better instead of just like rewriting the same thing in a different language. I wish I could give a better, more concrete example, but you know, sometimes it's hard to answer these questions off the top of my head. What else can I talk about here? Yeah, that's kind of the main thing. I'm just trying to think what else could what strategy would I recommend? So another huge tip is have working Kotlin samples beside you, such as repositories from Google samples / Android architecture, and I believe Google samples / Android architecture components. If I named these correctly, those are GitHub repositories. So when I converted my first application from Java to Kotlin, the whole time I was doing it, I had samples from these repositories open. And so the reason why is that you want to be basing your new Kotlin code on working Kotlin code. So while the code conversion tool, if you're not aware, where is it? So if you go just in Android Studio, go to Code, there's a tool you can use, convert Java file to Kotlin file. And that's how you can do this thing I was talking about up here, the code conversion tool. Now, sometimes that will not necessarily be very optimal. And then what you can do there is just kind of pour over how you normally basically find a working sample which is similar to how you normally build your apps, and use that as your guide as you're rebuilding your own application. That's the biggest tip I can give you, because there is no better resource to learning code than working application code, in my opinion. So that I don't think I've got much else useful to say there. That's kind of the main points for me. If you do have good samples beside you, you're going to have a pretty easy time converting things. And then what you'll need to get into next is looking into the more advanced things like coroutines. Now, again, when you're learning that stuff, really, really, really try to find good working code samples, because I broke my own rule, and I first tried to learn Kotlin from the documentation, and I utterly failed at it. This was a long time ago, whereas when I actually tried to just write a whole bunch of Kotlin code, then it became really easy. I am going to suggest a video to you, Mr. Verdant, or Mrs. Verdant, statistically speaking, Mr. So what I would suggest, I just released a video on my channel, I talked about this at the beginning, which basically explains my input on how to learn new things quickly and be able to use those new things in working applications quickly. So it's like the latest video on my channel. I would suggest you check that out, because it's along the lines of what you're asking me, and I In it, I expand upon my suggestions for how to basically learn Kotlin quickly or learn any new programming language quickly. So anyways, hopefully that helps. I'll stick around for another question or two. And I'm just going to run a quick commercial break. If you've enjoyed the show so far, please do me a favor, hit the like button down below. Oh, jeez. Crazy, I got disconnected from chat for a minute. Oh, okay, I guess Verdant already saw the video I talked about, so that's good. Hopefully I gave you some more extra useful information. Oh, my neck is sore. All right, maybe we'll do one more question if I have one. I see your question, Hey Studios. I've only ever worked with Firebase and the question was, are there any other options for a free cloud database or service other than Firebase? I've actually only ever worked with Firebase and Amazon Web Services. So I couldn't really give you a useful input. Firebase is pretty awesome for free, the free version, but you know, maybe there are better options. Oh, almost fell over. Okay, what else have we got? So Isam just, I guess, just came to the live stream, and I was going to explain continuous development and continuous integration. You didn't miss much. The basic gist of it, I gave a very vague, generalized explanation of how continuous integration works, but it's because I've only recently started working in an actual team of developers. I've only recently been working with basically a joint project continuous integration setup. So that doesn't mean that you don't need continuous integration or wouldn't want to use it if you were a single developer, but it's just not something I've spent a lot of time working on, which will change, but yeah, I just don't have a very good answer there. All right, well, I think that's going to be pretty much it for it today. Aswin asked a question, how is life? Life is, so if you're curious, this is basically end of show banter, so I'm not really going to answer any more Android questions. So if that's what you're here for, you can probably peace off until tomorrow or the next live stream. But just to riff on how my life is going, should you care, things are going really well. So over summertime, I was in a job environment that was really intense and awful, and I was coding along and learning alongside of that and writing. So over the summer, I'm sure several of my regular viewers saw me start to physically and mentally break down, because that was exactly what was occurring. And the situation that happened is I had this job which often forced me to work super late at night. It paid really well, but typically speaking, I would be getting to bed on bad days at 5 a.m., on a good day 3 a.m. And the thing about that is, while I don't really consider myself a morning person, I hate staying up late. I don't like staying up late, and I don't like sleeping in super late. So that occurred, and then at the same time, as some of my viewers will also know, they were renovating the decks for my apartment. And so the renovations during the weekdays would start at typically 9 a.m. and I could have like contractors with hammers and drills and saws literally right beside me at 9 a.m. I've gone to bed at 5 a.m. So that created a situation where I would end up having to go for weeks at a time getting 3 or 4 hours of sleep. I would wake up, typically speaking, at usually 12 o'clock, 12 p.m. Although oftentimes I would have to get up at 9 because those contractors would be doing their thing. And then I would study code for like 4 hours and try and write and do videos, but I didn't really get to. And then I would go to work from like 6, usually 4 or 6 p.m., something like that, until super late in the night. Longer story shorter, that really sucked. I'm glad I did it, and it really pushed my tolerance, my pain tolerance up a lot, but it started to really negatively affect my health. Now, I'm happy to say I quit that job. I've been given an opportunity to write a book. I was approached by a publisher, so I am currently writing like crazy every day. I've got multiple projects I'm working on, and I'm trying to do more videos. So suffice it to say, I am about as busy as I was over summer, except the reason why I'm enjoying myself is because everything I'm working on right now is something that I want to do. And so in some sense, it's just easier to deal with my own problems and my own concerns. It's easier for me to motivate myself in that regard, and so life is going pretty damn good. So thank you for asking. Apologies for rambling, but that's basically my situation now. I should be able to kind of keep this momentum going for a couple of months, and then we'll see how things go in December. But yeah, lots of projects going on. Anyways, that's basically it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will hopefully see some of you tomorrow for some more live coding. Peace out.